video is going to be on RP3. RP3 has a lot of different components, but the one we're going to focus on now is percentages. The first thing we need to know about percentages is that percentages are always out of 100. It doesn't matter if we have a 35%, a regular percent, and over 100%, like 110%, or even less than 1%, like 0.4%. They're all going to be over 100. Now, in order for us to actually work percentage problems, what we need to do is make sure that we know how to go from a decimal to a fraction to a percent, and from a percent and to a decimal and a fraction. So let's take a second and let's look at how to do that. 35% would also be 35 over 100. Now, that would be very similar to saying that we have 35 people that scored an A out of 100. So that's 35%. Now we can actually simplify that fraction to make it smaller numbers to understand, but still keep it equivalent. So we can simplify this, the top by 5 and the bottom by 5, because they're both divisible by 5. 35 divided by 5 is 7, and 100 divided by 5 is 20. So 7 20ths, 35 hundredths, and 35% are all the same thing. They're all equivalent. So at this point, we've talked about changing the percent to a fraction. Let's talk about changing that fraction to a decimal. So we're going to say 7 divided by 20. 20 cannot go into 7, but we can put a decimal and bring down a 0. So 20 can go into 70 3 times, which is 60. We're going to subtract and get 10. Let's pull down another 0. 20 can go into 100 5 times, which is 100. So 7 over 20 is the same thing as 35 hundredths. Okay? Now, another way you can look at that if you wanted to skip straight from a percent to a decimal is just divide by 100. Because you're saying 35 divided by 100, all you have to do is divide by 100. Now, if you remember the basics of decimals, dividing by 100 means we are getting smaller by 2 place values. So we're going to go to the left twice. So once, twice, and that gives us our 0.35 or our 35 hundredths. So now let's look at one that is going from a 3/4, a fraction, to a percent. So what we could do here is know that a percent is out of 100. And then you could say 4 times 25, because 4 quarters make 100 or $1. And then you could also do the same thing to the top, which is going to give us 75 out of 100. Anytime it's written out of 100, that's your percent. So 75%. Now you could also take that fraction and say 3 divided by 4, because a fraction is just a division problem. If you wanted the decimal, just divide it. 4 cannot go into 3. But we can put a decimal and a 0. 4 can go into 30 7 times, which is 28. Subtracting it 2, we can bring down another 0. So then 4 can go into 20 5 times. So that gives us 0.75 or 75 hundredths. Now, let's take that in consideration that we have 3/4. 3/4 would be like 3/4 out of 4 quarters. If you had 3/4 out of 4 quarters, that's 75 cents, which should make sense when we look at 0.75, because that's 75 cents or 75% of $1. All right, so let's look at taking a decimal to a percent or a fraction. So one thing is to take it to a percent, all you have to do is multiply by 100. So that means we're getting bigger by 2 place values. So we could move our decimal 2 places to the right. That gives us 95%. Now, here's what's really cool about this. You can also make a fraction very, very easily from a decimal. If you have a decimal and then a 95, take your 1 that's in 100 and put it under a decimal. Put it right under the decimal. Then put a 0 under every other digit that you have. So that right there tells you we have 95 out of 100, which is 95%, which is 0.95. Then you can just draw a line straight across and then start simplifying. So you could simplify this by 5. And that's going to give you 19 over 20, which also is the same thing as 95 over 100, which is the same thing as 95%, which is also the same thing as 0.95 or 95 hundredths.